Let me start by telling you, oh, there we are. Let me start by telling you what I'm going to talk about. First of all, I'd like to start with some history. I claim to be old enough to have most of this be memories, so thank you for letting me go down memory lane. But after a little jog through the changes we made in our business over the years, talk about some sources, and then end with some, I'd say some gratuitous self-interest in what we might be able to provide for people interested in building power plants. So, as we say in our business, we've always had a biomass problem. And in the days of old where merchantability standards were significantly different than we have today, we had one tool that worked pretty well for us. It was burning. And in the days of oxen, as you can see here in the bottom of the photograph, we burned 3 times. We burned before the trees were felled, and we burned after they were felled, and as you can see, there's still logging here in a forest that's obviously been burned. And again, when we were done, we burned it again. And that became such a great tool for us, we continued to do that well into the 20th century. In fact, it was just 10 or 15 years ago that we were using helicopters laden with alumigel and gasoline, essentially the same thing that they used in Vietnam. And we would burn 200 or 300 acres a year. And at that time, we were also managing flat ground with tractors. And so we could move the biomass around, find places to plant, and never really have a fire hazard. But things changed for us about 10 years ago. We changed our business largely because it became more and more difficult to manage with broadcast burning because of fire purposes and managing smoke at the same time. And we also began to use equipment like this so that we could avoid erosion. And building skid trails was the major cause of that from our point of view. So we converted to something called shovel logging. And the slash for us became a benefit because we walked our equipment on it and kept the slash from creating those skid trails that caused all that erosion we were concerned about. But unfortunately, it left the landscapes to look like this. And of course, you know, when you bring a logger here, he's going to show you the biggest log and the worst example of biomass accumulation, and this is it. But we had to figure out something to do with it. That's obviously a fire hazard in its own right and unplantable. There's no bare soil there. And so we did what I now understand is something that's good, not bad or ugly. So thank you for that. We piled and put small pieces of plastic on top so that this would stay dry enough to be a pile that would burn after a couple inches of rain. And we moved on to more mechanical logging in our business over the years, particularly in smaller piece sizes. And so where we can, we move logs in tree length fashion. And so another phenomenon that is new to our business is another piece of equipment that's new to our business is this. It's a stroker delimiter. And so with this piece of equipment arrayed along a road, you can take those tree length logs and turn them into piles that look like that. And so up to about 4 or 5 years ago, most of our landscapes looked like this, dotted with piles with little plastic spots on them and arrays of the tops of trees along the roadsides. And then along came something called BCAP, the Biomass Crop Assistance Program. And for once we found a federal program that actually delivered on what its promise was. And that was to get small businesses jump-started and get them to figure out how to perpetuate after the subsidy was gone away. And so one of our loggers decided he would take up the BCAP gauntlet, and he developed some innovative things. A fellow named Steve Morris Logging. He created some clamshell type devices to load this material up in the woods for us. And he used articulated four-wheel drive dump trucks to wander on the landscape and collect the materials, bringing them to a central place in the woods. He figured out how to use chip vans in a forest road setting and deliver this hog fuel to power plants. Now, just as I said, we love innovation in our business. You know you're doing enough when you do too much. And so this is an example of a slash bundler. We did some work with Humboldt State University's Han Supan. I think this was a demo We did here a couple of years ago. And although it looks great, it works great, it actually feeds into these hogging devices quite well, almost like delivering logs. The only bad news is that you can't afford to do it. So, the question that I've heard posed earlier today was, are we taking too much? And so I want to pose for you a before and after picture. This is what the world looks like before and after a biomass job. One of the breaks we have on answering that question of whether we're taking too much is a standard to leave everything behind that was there when we started on the ground. So any residual material from the first logging, any large woody debris, we try to leave it behind. And again, this is an example of something that we consider to be both fireproof and plantable with bare mineral soil. Well, I'm also happy to promote to say that the numbers I came here today with were also the same numbers I heard earlier today. About 30,000 tons to the acre is about the yield we've experienced. And so this is numbers from the last few years from our deliveries locally. And moreover, the most important number on this page is the one at the bottom, that we have more available to do than we have opportunities to do it. And it's driven by two bottlenecks. Number one, Steve Morris is only able to do as much as one contractor can do. And the biomass plants are only able to accept a certain amount of this. So I would argue that we could do 2 and 3 times this. Instead of 1,000 acres a year, we could do 2,000 or 3,000 acres a year into the future. But that's not it. We have another source of biomass. Many years ago, just after the war, logging processes superseded reforestation processes, if you will. And so we logged a lot and we didn't do much to put anything back. And we were logging on the east side of our ownership and ended up converting a lot of Douglas fir stands to Douglas fir and tan oak. And the yellow color you see here on this landscape is just that. The tan oak stands to the eastern perimeter of our property. So we try to convert those. It's a slightly different process. We convert those by moving these whole trees and almost in a forwarder fashion, if you're familiar with logging terms. We just dump the logs on and move them to a central location. But unlike the hogging devices, we use a chipper, because the trees are big enough that a hog won't make a suitable hog fuel. You have to put them through the chipping device. So, the good news for us is that we also own a shiny, brand new chip exporting dock right across the bay here in Samoa. And if anyone's driven out there recently, you see a significant pile of tan oak logs. And it's our objective to try to jumpstart that business. And we're working with Japanese exporters to put something back in play that was a viable and a consistent export market for us 15 or 20 years ago. We were selling 5 cargoes a year of tan oak. We'd love to do that again. The tan oak yield is about double in biomass that normal harvesting biomass yields. But there is a higher and better use for that, in our view, and that's to make fine writing paper. And so all we have to do is convince a customer or two that it's a good thing to do. The good news is, for that business, is that just across the street is a plant called DG Energy. And from our perspective and our experience, about 15% of the yield of tan oak logs is turned into biomass. So we can essentially shuttle that across the power plant, or shuttle that across the chip export dock right to the power plant. Well, I promised a slide of self-promotion, and here it is. I was grateful to hear that one of the ways that you can make electricity is very small power plants. One of the biggest costs to power plants is how far away you have to pull the fuel to make it work. And we just happen to be the proud owners of 5 industrial sites, one of which is still operating, but the other 4 are right north of us to the Oregon border there, Smith River. And so a flat spot that has power drop and it has arrayed around it both the logging debris and the tan oak resources. There should be a fine place for us to consider building these power plants. And I'd be happy to collect anyone's business card who's interested in doing that. So we have a flat spot and a lot of places to dispose of hog fuel. It sounds like maybe we can find someone who's interested in taking the other end of the business into power generation. So that concludes my remarks. And I guess the questions are happening at the end.
We have a little time for questions right now. So if anybody has a quick question, we can take it. And we'll have another opportunity after Mike to do a few more. So, question?
Test.
So Neil, I'm really curious about your use of tan oak. Are you having to, before you go through the chipper, are you having to debark the tan oak?
We don't debark tan oak if we're going to use it for hog fuel,
Right.
because we can burn it.
Right.
But if we're sending tan oak overseas as chips, we have a very low tolerance for bark in the tan oak furnace, because the other problem we have, I didn't mention today, is the so-called sudden oak death disease. And when you try to export a product, even if it's in chip form, there are some countries that will not allow anything of any tan oak at all, regardless of whether it's been debarked. Korea is an example, Canada is another. But Japan and China are still open to allowing tan oak if it has gone through a debarking process.
Okay, and it was my understanding that, taking the bark off, it vastly reduces the amount of drying time anyways for your product. So, and then, so the other question I had to deal with, are you talking about turning the tan oak chips into fine writing paper?
Yes. Well, first they go through the pulping process.
Right, but is that what you're hoping maybe for the evergreen mill? And
well, the evergreen mill was a source of demand for tan oak over the years, and they weren't able to make a go of it. The pulp manager there told me they didn't like to use tan oak. They were a softwood pulp mill. They made kraft paper, but they used it like he said, hamburger helper. It sort of stretched out the supply, and it didn't pollute it too badly, is what he told me. So they're happy to use it, but it wasn't ever a hardwood pulp mill.
Okay, thanks.
Other quick questions? We probably have time for one more.
So just to follow up on that, so you're doing export of pulp chips is what you hope to do with the tan oak?
Yes, that's our objective, is to find Asian markets. If you've paid attention to the Chinese, I think the second largest economy now in the world, they're growing at 8 or 9%, and they're also growing inside pulping capacity rather than buying market pulp. They're trying to create it themselves. So a lot of the pulp today comes from a couple of sources: plantations and eucalyptus around the Pacific Rim, and also a reasonably large source of acacia from Vietnam. Although my understanding that's it's really farmer-type wood. In other words, it's almost generated over the shoulder into the marketplace, and it's not managed in a sustainable way. So we think there's a gap in supply that we'll be able to fit our tan oak resource into.
And is that chip load facility in operation?
Yeah, it works for anyone who's willing to give me a contract. We'll load their boat. So yes.
All right. Thanks, Neil.
Thank you.
Excellent. Really appreciate it. So our next speaker is the Fuels Program Manager. Did I get it right, Mike? Yeah. For the Six Rivers National Forest, Mike Beasley. And I'm going to turn this mic off and get you set up here.
Okay. I could probably project pretty well if you guys want to just hear my normal speaking voice. Can you guys hear in the back fine?
Well, we've got some people who are logged in virtually, and your voice does project, but not that well.
Yeah. I can't send it down the wire. Okay. Thanks. Well, good morning. And again, I do like the pre-lunch spot. And Peter asked me to come and talk about potential sources of feedstock for biomass utilization on the Six Rivers. And I told him that probably I'm going to come up and have more barriers than opportunities to give folks today. And I'm glad Bruce is here. We also have the Timber Program Manager for the forest, Jeff Jones, is here in the front. We work together on a lot of projects on the forest, and we have tried to work biomass utilization into the design of some of these projects, but we'll get into that. Really, I want to backtrack and talk about the mission of the Forest Service. The mission of the Forest Service is undergoing some change in certain places. It used to be all about timber production, and there's still working forests all over the United States in the southeast and other places. But here in the Six Rivers, we're turning a lot more towards restoration and ecosystem services, providing clean water, providing suitable fisheries. And Bruce, if I go astray from any Washington office guidance, please give me the light. Okay. You're way off base there. But, you know, the history of the Six Rivers is it was part of the Northwest Forest Plan that was centered around the spotted owl recovery. And, you know, there was a lot of logging, a lot of cutting going on forests out here. And then that just kind of came to a sudden stop after the Northwest Forest Plan. And, you know, it continues on at a much lower level on the forest, but at a much reduced level. And there's a much reduced capacity also for, you know, for that material because of that. And we have a lot of unhealthy forest sites, a lot of plantations, because we don't have the timber revenue coming in anymore to take care of a lot of the lands that we're under production. You know, we have a lot of old plantations that haven't received a lot of treatment in the last 10 or 20 years. And those are real fire hazards for us. So those are some of the areas we're turning to in sort of a restoration sense. We're trying to manage now more for old growth characteristics on the Six Rivers. I came from the Park Service. I worked there for over 20 years and worked down in Yosemite. So that was what we're trying to do there a lot as well. And a lot of our management plans for national parks, for instance, you know, directed us to try to manage for pre-settlement conditions. You know, again, managing for old growth if you can. And nowadays, management plans, that's kind of passé. We don't talk about pre-settlement conditions. I mean, as a nod to the North Coast air quality folks, I don't think many of our mountain residents would like pre-settlement smoke conditions. I mean, the flat matter of the fact is that if you live in a fire-adapted ecosystem, like the Klamath-Siskiyou Mountains or the Sierras, it's not a reasonable expectation that you're going to have healthy air quality year-round. You know, those are fire-adapted ecosystems, and they burn, and they're going to burn. You know, we talk a lot about how can fuel treatments help mitigate costs of wildfires. I think that's a good point. But another fact of the matter is wildfire fighting comes from non-appropriated funds. It's emergency funds. They tap into you know, non-appropriated monies, and it is a big business for a lot of firms and companies. So, and they have lobbyists, and so firefighting, you know, is a big business, and it goes on non-appropriated dollars. What we're trying to do on the forest in terms of timber projects and in terms of hazardous fuels projects, that's appropriated dollars, and there aren't many of those around anymore. It's a lot harder to get funding. Like fuels positions are getting cut, timber positions are getting cut, at least on this forest, because we don't really have timber revenue to kind of come in and help out. And, you know, there is no real surrogate for prescribed burning or for putting fire on the landscape. There's no full mechanical surrogate for that. I did a lot of burning at Yosemite, and I went down and looked at that rim fire and how it came into the park. And, you know, there's a lot of concern about the threat to Yosemite National Park. But the fact is we had done a lot of prescribed burning. They had a robust fuels program. There was a lot of prescribed fire going on. There was thinning. There was a lot of piling. I got the first service contract that the Park Service had ever done with an outfit to do a bunch of piling, you know, do a lot of hand piles in Yosemite. And all of that thinning definitely helps. I look at forest structure. You know, as a fire behavior analyst, you know, what we look at is the height of live crown. That's the key thing. We talked about ladder fuels. So that's one thing that mechanical treatments can do. The picture with the Megram fire was an excellent example of that. If you do take out the ladder fuels, the small diameter trees, and do thinning from below, you can have the effect of stopping crown fire. But to really restore a fire-adapted ecosystem, you got to come in and do the prescribed burning. The only thing that's going to stop a fire is either the fact that you've prescribed burn there in the last few years, or you have a watered lawn, or you've scraped every single pine needle and fine fuel that can carry fire away from your home. That's the only thing that'll stop fire. So what we're talking about with these biomass projects is modifying fire behavior, hopefully modifying it so that there's less crown fire. And that's what we want to see. And that can give firefighters an opportunity to get into those places and then put the fire out more safely. You know, if the fire has dropped out of the crowns and is just on the surface, then you can actually do something with it. So, all that being said, there is tremendous opportunity on the North Coast for this biomass utilization, but the forest in particular, the lands that we have under production are closer to the coast, they're closer to the existing biomass facilities, and their haul costs are lower for that reason. Our haul costs are higher. We face headwinds with our planning and from the environmental community. I mean, one thing about prescribed burning and fuel treatments, there's a stronger case for the need in dry pine forests, where your forest, your litter and duff and small woody debris that accumulates on the forest floor, that it just sits there in a dry climate. It ponderosa pine and that sort of thing, and it doesn't go anywhere. So there's a real need for fire to clean it up. Out here, as you get closer to the coast especially, a lot of that duff and woody debris goes away through decomposition. It's wetter out here, and a lot of that material just turns into soil a lot more quickly. So it is a little bit harder sometimes to make the case that you've got to get in here and do something. But we do need to make that case around the communities and directly around people's homes. That's where the work needs to happen, is in people's backyards. And it is a harder case to make for a big project far away from communities. But what we have done in the Six Rivers is look at strategic ridge lines. That's where we place most of our projects, is around communities on nearby strategic ridge lines where we could actually get firefighters in there, do a fuel treatment, reduce the fuels, do a thinning from below, and hopefully do some prescribed burning. But again, I'll just go over quickly some of the challenges and opportunities that I came up with here for the positives. And also remember that as far as the material is concerned, that we can actually sell in timber sales. So the most valuable material is not the problem for fire control and for risk abatement for wildfires. You know, the highly merchantable, large diameter trees, that's what you want to keep on the landscape if you can. But that has the highest value, and that's what we have to sweeten the pot generally with the projects, with some of that material to even pay for getting rid of the non-merchantable, unimportant stuff that really is the key to reducing the threat of wildfires. The small diameter woody material, the ladder fuels, and some of the forest debris on the forest floor. So that's a problem for us, because it's very hard. The more large diameter trees and merchantable material you use to sweeten the pot, the more the eyes of the environmental groups will be on that project, and they're more likely to litigate oftentimes. So some of the positives are that we are incorporating these biomass design features into our project planning. We're yarding tops out. We're making sure that our operators are not leaving us with a big fuels problem after we're done. We're designing these projects with sorting decks in mind, where you could do some sorting. We're thinking about chip vans and what landings we can get chip vans to when we design these projects. And we are opening up as much ground as we can to biomass utilization, but bearing in mind the Klamath Mountains are darn steep, and steepness of slope is a huge consideration out here. You start talking to a contractor to do piling, on nice, even, flat ground, you might only pay a few $100 an acre for piling small diameter woody debris, but on steep ground such as ours, we'll pay up to $1,500 an acre to just pay a crew to go out there and create hand piles. So it's very expensive and very labor intensive, and we can only run heavy equipment on, what's our limitation on slopes, steepness? 35%. So, when you take a look at a map of the Klamath Mountains, there's not a lot of ground that's less than 35% slope. So that's a big barrier for us. Let's see, other opportunities. Our most successful biomass utilization program that we have is firewood cutting, and opening up firewood cutting to the public. And a lot of that, it's a really good thing that we can provide to the public, and it buys us a lot of good favor with the local communities. And we just changed some of our rules for firewood cutting to allow the cutting of standing dead material. So we're slowly enabling the public to take more and more out by way of firewood cutting. So barriers. Our planning is slow. We have an unreliable source of feedstock. I've seen a few projects in the Southwest. There's a Four Forests initiative, I think a 10-year stewardship plan there. And Bruce, what happened? There was also a project out of Placerville, I believe. There was some demonstration work done. There was an ex-Forest Service forest supervisor that was working with the Air District in Placerville, and they were going to build a small biomass plant. And is it happening? Because I'd heard it had gotten litigated and it had faced some legal challenges. Okay. So that's a great model for California right there. And it did have a lot of involvement with the air districts. And their support was critical there. So we do different kinds of contracts. We have stewardship contracts and then the older traditional timber contracts. The stewardship contracts, I think our operators have a hard time developing project proposals for some of these complex stewardship projects. We put in these different things we want the operators to do, different optional pieces to the contract, and essentially what happens every time we try to promote the biomass utilization, we usually have to take that component out because we can't get a bid on the project. You know, folks, there's just no money in it for the operators. The haul costs are too great, and there's not enough, and we're just not a reliable enough source is my read on that. And then we were competing with the cheap natural gas, but I see now there's an initiative to try to go ahead and pay the high cost per megawatt hour to go ahead and subsidize. It's going to have to be subsidized, and we're going to need to do these 10-year stewardship projects. It does seem like that small scale, localized, the trailer mounted idea. I know you guys have heard this a million times. The trailer mounted idea, plug it into the grid, take it to the landing. It would be great. That would be a super solution if that could happen. But I know there's barriers to that. But it does seem like the small scale, localized efforts would be really good, like to provide power for, say, Hoopa, or a town like Orleans, some small mountain town that doesn't have a whole lot of power generation requirements. I think that's the way you could probably go with it, but it's going to have to be close to the feedstock and the material, where the material's coming out of. But overall, I think that I love the report that the Schatz Lab did, and that tried to show how we could be energy independent on the North Coast and have a large biomass component to that as part of our portfolio of renewable energy. It makes a lot of sense, because I think natural gas is just going to be another short-term solution that will eventually play out, and we'll be looking for something else. So that's all I had.
Great, thanks, Mike. Some time for questions. I had just a quick question for you.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the different mechanisms you have for contracting, service contracts, and I guess there's maybe two or three. Maybe you could just specify those, like, specifically, and then maybe say what the Six Rivers has engaged with currently, like the volume that's in stewardship contracts, timber sales.
The best that we have gotten since I've been here is one sale a year is about, and you could help me with volume. It's not much, nothing to write home about. You know, it's just it's been a slow, painful process for planning, and then having to deal with litigation sometimes, even when we do get NEPA documents done. So.
All right, so any other questions? We've got a little time for both. Actually, Neil, if you'd like to step up here, and we've got other questions from the audience. We can take them now.
Thanks both for great presentations. My question is for Neil. So BCAP got you guys motivated and started. So I think BCAP's over, is that correct? And so how's it working out now in that frame?
Well, I'm glad you asked. we supplanted a federal subsidy with one of our own. So whereas in the past, the fellow that's doing this work was paid by the government to get started, he developed a process that turned out to be cheaper than our alternative, which is to use to continue slash burning, make piles happen, and so on. And so we have to reduce the fuel load, and we have to provide places to plant. So it's the least costly alternative for us. One thing I didn't mention was the thing that defeats most power plants is the cost of delivery. It's the distance away from the fuel. And so that you could almost draw a line around our ability to do this work. It's based on the haul cost to get it to market. So again, remember the last slide I showed with the map where all the flat spots are.
Just for those of you who don't know, BCAP stands, and I forget what the C is for, Biomass something, Biomass Crop Assistance Program, federal program. And it does still exist, but it's now really aimed at crops that are planted specifically for biomass energy and aimed more towards agricultural crops than the forestry crops. And I think it still exists. Isn't that right, Bruce? Yeah, I think it does. But this kind of work doesn't apply anymore. It doesn't work.
We don't want to make a habit of becoming a federal subsidy.
Well, that's right. That was part of the problem with it. The federal subsidies are great while they can get some things started, but you can't live on them forever. Is the banker still in here? And also, there was a lot of concern about a program like that because then there was problem with competition of feedstocks. The biomass that would have gone into things like composite panels, particle board, veneer, things like that, was being now priced out of the market because the BCAP was adding more value to biomass fuel than to those products, and that caused some concern in the forest products industry. You're done.
So what's your haul distance line?
Well, I'm glad to say you've reached my level of incompetence. I don't know. You know, we're able to do it where we have flat, straight roads, probably within the working circle of Corbell. We can't make it work in Klamath, which is anything north of Redwood Creek in our Klamath operation. And in miles, okay, probably 30 miles is the limit, I would guess, and not more than half of that off-road.
Pretty much everything we have is outside of that.
Yeah, I'm sorry for you.
All right, additional questions? One in the back. Fulfilling my childhood fantasy to be Phil Donahue here today.
I'm just wondering if there's a kind of a magic number or a rule of thumb number on what percentage of an acre, if we were to go into the Six Rivers and harvest biomass for a power plant, how much would you want to make sure was left behind for prescribed fires by percentage?
Well, the prescribed fire, all you need is the surface fuels. I mean, and that's going to carry the day for your prescribed burning is just the duff and litter and that kind of material. So we have a lot of limitations also on our prescribed fire program that are vexing. Just in terms of limited operating period for owls, we can't hardly burn in the spring because of the noise and smoke lops, limited operating periods. And then in the fall, they want us to retain a certain number of logs, coarse woody debris on the forest floor, and retain 50% soil cover. You know, and those are all difficult constraints to do in the fall. And spring is just about out of the question because of the owl in a lot of places. So, but you could take a lot of the small diameter standing woody material for biomass, and that would be great because it would reduce your crown fire threat. You could take a lot of that. I mean, if you can even fireproof an overstock stand. If you take an overstock stand and run fire under it successfully, you'll have a sort of a fireproof. You can have independent crown fires, but those are kind of rare, although they're becoming more common. But you can, if you run fire underneath an overstock stand and burn up all that surface fuel, then you'll kind of fireproof your overstock stand. You'll make it so it won't burn in the future, although it could run through there in a crown fire. So the other limitation too on the owl is we have to retain 60% canopy cover across the landscape in most places. So, you know, that's also a big constraint for us.
Other questions?
Hi, thanks. Great presentations. This question is for Neil. Are you currently taking advantage of the air quality credits that was described earlier?
The air quality credits, no, we're not taking advantage of any subsidy from air quality.
I believe it was where if you replaced the burning and the emission from burning with an alternative, which is removal, you could potentially receive credits for that or sell your credits on the market.
Yeah, so the clear answer to that is no.
Other questions?
Just want to make a clarifying statement. I'm with the Mendocino Coast Biomass Collaborative, and we actually have done a study about the trucking costs. And we identified for our site in Fort Bragg about a 30-mile radius for fuel. And that's pretty much standard for our area.
Other questions? Just a quick question for Mike that I had. So just for the sake of discussion, say there was a project developer in the region looking to secure feedstock for a plant going forward, came to the Forest Service and wanted to try to sort out a method where they could, generate some volume over a relatively long period. And obviously stewardship contracts would probably be the mechanism. What kind of things would you present back to that proponent and say, you really need to think about this, that, the other, kind of maybe talk a little bit about some of the constraints there?
Okay, a stewardship contract, essentially, traditional contract for logging would be you sell the timber, you get the revenue, you might put some into one of two trust funds, KV or BD, and those monies can be used after the sale is over to do some things on the landscape to clean it up. But the stewardship contract, you may have to help me out here, Jeff. You front load all that work, all the BD, all the brush disposal, all the hauling of tops, getting rid of all your, essentially, and also you're doing fuel reduction work as part of the timber sale. So and that timber revenue is in some of the revenue that is received by the operator, the person that bids successfully, is then to be used for the cleanup, for the fuel reduction work. And that can be a lot more than just yarding tops. That can be also going in and creating fuel breaks, digging fire lines, and doing a lot of thinning and other work associated with that. And those are, you can have them be either optional. I'm going to get way over my head here, so Jeff might have to step in. But you can have optional items, or you can have mandatory items that you can tag on to that stewardship contract.
Yeah, stewardship contracts are exactly like that. Typically, there are certain things that you want done based upon your plan, and when you plan it, you want it to get done. And with a stewardship, you're trying to get jobs back to the community. That's the whole idea of a stewardship contract. And typically, like Mike says, you have optional and you have required items. And like he had mentioned before, when you have required items that are costly, then we get no bids typically, and that really slows us down. And you can have long-term contracts, but those are still the issues that you have to face.
Yeah, I think you'd have to go, just based on the funding and from the banker perspective and getting the loans, it seems like the 10-year event horizon is pretty important to go into the long-term stewardship contract, which would be a first for us, but it wouldn't be undoable. It would be good to see, really.
How many stewardship contracts do you have on the forest? Roughly?
Right now, what, 4 or 5?
Today we spend a lot of time on trying to look at financially justification of cost of biomass, logging, 1122 and all that. I think they're all tied to some extent that the cost of biomass and the transportation, how to bring it out from the forest and all that. My question is really that if there is a piece of equipment that can be close to where the source of the biomass is or in the forest, and that can generate synthetic fuel, which is a drop-in fuel, diesel, gasoline, or whatever, at half the cost of today what you purchase, or less than half the cost you purchase on the gas pump. Would there be an interest for Anyone sitting in this room? And what I mean is that the gasoline or diesel gas will be produced at $1.70 a gallon, and it can be produced very near the source of the biomass of the forest and all that. You'll be reduced the transportation costs on bringing diesel up to the hill to support your equipment that doing the logging and all that. Would that be something feasible? Who should I talk to? Anyone that would be interested?
I'll take that question, and it's part of what I'm going to address this afternoon in my presentation. But you know, it's a question that we hear a lot about, and the technologies do exist to make those kinds of products drop-in transportation fuels, which means that they fit right into, they drop into our existing infrastructure for transportation fuels. There are technologies that exist, but there's also the costs to get to that point are really quite high, and it comes back to this economic question. And I think everybody in this room is interested in that. But the question you bring up is, how do you make it happen? And I think there's a scale issue. He wants to comment. I think there's a scale issue that goes along with these because the economies of scale typically are pointing to larger installations.
If the return on investment, considering that you fund the whole thing without a bank, is 2 years.
Yeah, if you can demonstrate that that's true, you've got a great idea that I think everybody in this investment community and everybody in this room would be interested in.
And just to respond to that, we have looked over the last 4 years or so for all kinds of alternatives to use biomass that include cellulosic ethanol, biodiesel, torrefied products, and pellets. And we're happy to look at anything anyone could do to add more value to this. In fact, to add positive values. As I said earlier, this is a drag on earnings for us. It's better than the next best alternative.
It is a drop-in field. It's a drop-in field. No new gas station.
Hi, Winslow Condon from North Coast Air Quality. There have been a few questions about emissions offsets in regards to biomass burning and emissions reductions credits. So I just thought I'd try to explain that a little bit further just so everyone knows what we're talking about. Jason Davis touched on it in his presentation. The emission offsets from biomass burning are like an alternative to emissions reductions credits. So say, for example, you have a biomass power plant proposal, and they go over those thresholds, like for particulate matter that Jason was talking about. Say they're going to be potentially emitting 50 tons of PM. They've got to reduce that amount of PM back to zero. One way of doing that is purchasing emission reduction credits. The other way is offsetting those emissions by reducing biomass burning in the field and then burning it instead in the controlled environment of a boiler with, say an ESP or some other control devices. So by not burning it in the field, so to speak, like someone like Green Diamond wouldn't be securing an emission reduction credit. They would be selling their fuel to the power plant, and the power plant would be offsetting their emissions in that manner as opposed to purchasing emission reduction credits. And those offsets have to be obtained like on a quarterly basis, and they're just ongoing. So if they run out of a way to obtain the fuel to offset those emissions, that's when problems may arise. You've got that 30-mile or so radius from the power plant. If you exhaust your fuel supply in that area and you have no other means of offsetting your emissions, that's when it starts to get a little bit tricky. But as we all know, there's a lot of fuel out there, even in that 30-mile radius, can keep a power plant going for a long time, I'd imagine. So anyway, if you have any further questions, feel free to, just grab me and we can talk.
Right, we got time for one more question.
Yeah, thanks
I
for that.
see the hand and way in the back. Peter, run.
You say run, I run, John.
Good morning. This question is for Mike. The Six Rivers National Forest is one of the most diverse forests on Earth, and I'm just curious if any thought's been put forward in providing feedstock for these biomass plants. Is there any plan to either preserve or enhance the diversity of the forest for cultural resources or any other reasons?
Well, it's that very diversity that that makes it challenging to work in the forest, and it's a great place to work too. But it really is of these other ecosystem services that the forest provides, water quality, some of the cultural things you mentioned. I mean, it makes it. I'm not really sure I understand your question entirely. Like, how would we preserve the? We would definitely attempt to preserve the biodiversity of the ecosystem. We understand that and would want to retain that.
Right. Is there any thought or language that is being crafted into contracts for companies to preserve the biodiversity of the forest?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Certainly.
Inherently in our projects, that's what we specify in our project. We have to do that. That's an end result. And, then we just get a product out, and the end result's going to be, ecosystem services and ecological restoration and that sort of thing. And, how it's done, as long as it meets that goal, then the purchasers don't have to worry about it. I mean, they have to maintain their best management practices so they can get the wood out of the woods in a way that is not just destroying or disrupting the ecosystem. But that's usually not an issue because we're pretty good at doing that. Yeah, there's penalties. They could shut them down, and then they don't want that.
We need more heterogeneity in terms of habitat out there. I mean, as far as the prescribed fire program that I can speak more towards, you look at a megrim fire and you have a big wide swath of high mortality, and now we're starting to punctuate that with some smaller fires, the Backbone Fire, the Corral Fire this last year, and that environment up there in the high country of the Trinity Alps, because of the frequency of fires and really the inability of suppression to really have a lot of impact up there, it's starting to look a lot more like that high country should look like, with pockets of timber in the ravines and the drainages and draws, and then more open country, meadows, some shrublands. It looks a lot like what we strove for intentionally in the high country of Yosemite with allowing wildfires to burn. The same kind of effect. You're going to have mortality. You're going to have some tree mortality. A lot of folks look at mortality as a waste, just like folks looked at rivers running free, undammed, out to the ocean as a waste. But that's a process. It's an ecosystem process, and it needs to keep occurring. So, and that creates diversity on the landscape and diversity of habitat.
Great, thank you. Thanks all the speakers this morning. Excellent job. I thought very interesting morning. Very good. It's lunchtime. We have the sandwiches are over here. The drinks are in the back of the room. If you did not sign up for a vegetarian lunch, please do not take one. We have 9 of them at the end of the counter. You are the people who